I'm very grateful to Iftikhar and John for the invitation to be here, and to all the organizers of the Climate Congress and to the attendees, and thank you, all of you, for being here. I'm privileged to share today a section of my book in progress, whose working title you see here is The Intractable Garden, Improvement and Unruliness in Lahore's Landscapes. Over the last few days, Climate Congress attendees have experienced in very direct ways what residents in Lahore know in their bodies, in their eyes, throats, skin, gastrointestinal tracts, lungs, and what the rest of the world is seeing, once again, as numbers and statistics, that this erstwhile city of gardens is one of the most polluted and climate-stressed places in the world. This is, of course, true of the air and the water that we have all imbibed and we are all imbibing, but also of the soils, our river, rising temperatures, disease-carrying mosquitoes, and much more. The vulnerabilities produced by the climate catastrophe or by these environmental harms are, of course, socially mediated and deeply unevenly distributed. So what most of us in this room experience on a day-to-day is only a fraction of what is meted out to the majority of urban residents. The causes and political ecologies of the climate catastrophe, as it plays out in Lahore, are numerous: unchecked urbanization, fuel prices, agricultural systems, industrial contamination, meteorological dynamics across broad regions, glacier melt, and much more. My book makes the argument that to understand Lahore today, we also need to look at the past, and we need to look outside the city in addition to looking inside it. So Lahore's urban landscape, as pretty much all of us know, has been long associated with cultivated nature. While this legacy is certainly traceable to Sultanate and Mughal era patronage of landscape design, it emerges as a distinct aesthetic agenda, as a particular imaginary, as a particular identity of urban governance in the mid-19th century, in lockstep with the colonial state's attempts to re-engineer Punjab's landscapes into economically productive terrains. In my work, I have observed how, and I continue to observe, how the material, political, and ideological history of quite literally changing the climate under colonial rule in Punjab continues to press on the contemporary city, and how it is continuously challenged in the contemporary city. I explore this in relation to soils, we talked a little bit about that earlier, water, trees, mosquitoes, and atmospheres. And before moving forward, I want to explain a little bit the book's driving concept, intractability. This refers to the quality of being difficult to govern or difficult to control. While the complete social and technical transformation of Earth systems and biological life is the defining story, maybe, of modern environmental history, the so-called Anthropocene, aspirations to constrain or contain or control more than human life and nature's feels now more than ever quite wrong-headed and futile. So to me, this term intractability is at foremost a reminder of the persistence and friction of materials, ecologies, and practices that run up against the prescriptions of colonial design. And they reveal its contingency, its partiality, and of course, its unevenness. But I'm also interested in the root word tract, which refers to many different things. There's like a bunch of different meanings. But tract, in two different ways I'm very interested. One is the extents of territories, right, the tract. And then the other is the act of pulling, attraction, tractors, extract. So these two things to me indicate or they signal, or they're a good reminder to think both of, to hold together geographies, places, territories, as well as practices, ways of working, and as interlinked dimensions of environmental change. So quite simply, our places and what we do in them and with them. In this sense, the centrality of land and of soil and how people work or engage it is key. And this is the focus of my ongoing project with Hiranabi that I mentioned earlier and other interlocutors. And then from a different perspective, that's what I want to talk about today. In the 1878 annual garden report of the Agri-Horticulture Society of Punjab, Edgar Spooner, the garden superintendent, wrote of his intention to clear the ground in a particular spot, to have it leveled and drained and cleared and replanted. He noted that water from an escape canal in this location had formerly been used by dhobis. And for those of you who don't know, dhobis refers to people who wash clothes, washermen or washerwomen. Recalling, quote, a very offensive smell due to the number of dhobis frequenting it, rank vegetation, and the water becoming stagnant, end quote, Spooner described plans to develop a new pond following the natural contours of the land, which would provide irrigation and drainage for cereal crops, vegetables, fodder, and other plants in the surrounding areas. This, he added, would bring a great improvement to that quarter of the garden. Published since the garden's inception in the 1860s, these annual reports frequently detail these kinds of ongoing efforts to clear the land and to deal with these perceived material deficiencies, the salinity, the defective drainage, the standing water, and pests, and other kinds of blight. But this report, this particular report in 1878, to me, offers just a tiny hint of social context that is not there in some of the others. And I'm interested in what that means. What might we make of the erstwhile presence of dhobis in this area and the clearing of their site of work? So for that, to think about that, I am inspired by historian of architecture Swati Chattopadhyay's work on small spaces. She writes that in an architectural sense, we can think of small spaces as, quote, adjunct spaces that play supporting roles to the main architectural event in a building. And we can all think of what those might be. But also, these are moments that are relegated to margins in space, in time, in discourse. And they comprise, quote, a fragmentary landscape created through repeated processes of racial, caste, gender, and class sorting, end quote. So attention to smallness, to invisibilized fragments, to unlikely moments is one way to estrange and refuse the coloniality of our sources and our ways of thinking. Chattopadhyay argues that, quote, a shift in scale and shift in perspective or vantage point, as well as a focus on labor and materiality, can amplify the historical import of these unlikely small moments. And in this talk, I want to interpret this incidental fragment in Lahore's recorded history by zooming out towards a broader picture of colonial regional improvement, its racializing and casteist logics, and its unfolding afterlives in Lahore. How can reevaluating this moment help us apprehend and challenge or think about how place and land was transformed and how it continues to be transformed in the city today? In The Conflict Shoreline, which is a collaboration with photographer Fazil Sheikh, Al Weissman examines the threshold which marks the change from the ostensible desert to intensively farmed, forested, and settled territory in the Negev, in Israel-occupied Palestine. In meteorology, this threshold is naturalized in the form of the 200 millimeter isohyet, or the aridity line. And this indicates the minimum annual precipitation that is required to sustain cultivation without artificial irrigation. This line, he writes, indicates, quote, an ongoing historical process by which political developments have violently interacted with changing climatic conditions along this seam. Across this edge, colonialism has used intensive forestation, farming, artificial irrigation for changing the climate, for pushing the desert back, for making it bloom. and with that, displacing indigenous inhabitants, erasing life worlds, and severing relations. Wiseman writes that the shoreline of the desert, which extends from northern Africa through the Middle East, through the Negev, across Syria, Afghanistan, and into Pakistan, across it, the climate has always been a project for colonial powers, which have continuously acted to engineer it. And we can then follow the aridity line, and with it, the intentional forces of colonial climate change into the Indus Valley of Punjab, in Punjab. Here, starting in the 1850s, after the annexation of by the East India Company, the political economy of empire was built on an environmental and technological imaginary of transforming so-called deserts or so-called semi-arid desert wastelands of the interfluvial areas into irrigated and settled agricultural territory. We get a really vivid description or representation of this imaginary in a mid-1860s watercolor painting of the river Ravi near the village of Madhupur, and now across the border in India. Painted by Henry Baden Powell, a prominent member of the colonial civil service in India, this image features the headworks of the Bari Doab Canal, the first of what then became an extensive, vast perennial irrigation system built in the region during and after British colonial rule. And that's the extent of those systems circa 1900, maybe a little later, maybe 1920. While inundation agriculture had been practiced for centuries in the fertile alluvial plains along Punjab's rivers, the semi-arid interfluvial areas, or what we call doabs, had been sparsely cultivated and were home to a cattle-grazing pastoral population. Starting in the mid-19th century, these became the colonial state's primary focus to be enclosed, irrigated, settled, and made productive in the coming decades. Over the course of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the region underwent significant change, economic, infrastructural, societal, as millions of acres of land were brought into new forms of productivity and settlement. The project and the ideology of improvement in this context built on a longer history of reorganizing and revaluing land and resources through the enclosure of agrarian spaces and agricultural development, and as well as through things like economic botany, forestry, and urban and sanitary reform. So back to the painting, here we see the very narrow stream of the Ravi, which is the smallest of the Indus Basin rivers, flowing across the middle of the image. It is sandwiched between the monumental form of the headworks right in the foreground, and then the lush hillsides behind, right behind it. The stream extends beyond the confines of the picture plane. In the distance, blending into the clouds, the snow-capped peaks of the Himalayas point to the source of the water that now flows from river to canal. With its picturesque template of green vegetation, flowing water, a small ruin, human and animal figures dotting the foreground, the painting projects an image of a fertile and productive landscape to come. So at this moment, the canal wasn't actually built. We have contemporaneous photographs showing this site in rubble. But he projects ahead. He shows that kind of idea of turning the desert into the garden in this painting. It's an evocative reminder that the project of improvement wove economic, environmental, and social motivations together with moral and aesthetic tropes. In the context of improvement, the ground, the soil, in fact, becomes a central focus of the colonial state. I think of it as a materially, ideologically, and socially thick strata of concern. In a short 1857 text entitled Remarks on the Agriculture of the Punjab, published retroactively in the compiled papers of the Agri-Horticulture Society, opens with contrasting descriptions of the, quote, two very marked features of the region. The first is the highly fertile alluvial land along Punjab's river valleys, which has been, quote, for ages the receptacle of comminuted matter of every kind, vegetable and mineral, derived from the Great Himalayas and are full of the finest mold. So the river valleys being the kind of fertile landscape. In contrast, the areas comprising the intervals between the great rivers, the doabs, are of a, quote, more arid description, which form the chief surface of the country. Now, the unnamed author described these areas as being in a, quote, primeval state, whose richness, quote, thinned out as you moved south from the Himalayan foothills. In some parts, and I'm going to quote in little bits from this text, in some parts was mere sandy wastes, in others covered with bushy jungle, and some others blank and desolate. These impressions of the land, which are echoed widely in contemporaneous literature, were followed then by prescriptions to, quote, direct our attention to the poorer lands which are beyond the influence of the rivers. So the doabs are the target of improvement. From the outset, soils come into focus as an imperfect but ready conscripts within the discourses and technologies and political economies of improvement. In 1851, soon after the annexation of Punjab, the Governor General, Lord Dalhousie, issued a memorandum about the treeless, unrelieved plains of Punjab. His diatribe was less of a lament and more of a call to action to colonial administrators. He links here environmental deficiency to cultural practice rather than to material properties, and writes, the soil with a little care is a grateful one. And this is not only a rhetorical flourish. Colonial discourse during this time is thick with scientific and technical and practical recommendations for understanding and manipulating and improving the conditions of the ground as a prerequisite for value assessment and capture. So for the newly established territory to brought into to the sphere of capitalist accumulation, the ground had to be reworked and its yield had to be increased. This didn't just mean demarcating boundaries, it also meant digging and draining and trenching and tilling, manuring, excavating, breaking up, embanking, flattening, seeding. In a region frequently read by colonial lenses as a patchwork of fertility and aridity, the kind of material and technical improvement of soil is foundational to the enhancement and expansion of property regimes and to the kind of development of agriculture in the province. So in this context, I'm going to shift scales again to go back to Lahore's changing groundscapes at this time. With the annexation of Punjab in 1849 and then direct colonial rule in 1857, the colonial state embarked on a program to reconfigure Lahore and its surroundings to accommodate the growing population and increased government functions. During this time, the city grew in a southeastern direction with the building of the civil station and new monumental architecture, wide avenues, residential areas, and a cantonment for military officers. Urban development of Lahore featured an extensive program of landscape and gardens. Prominent in this new landscape were the lawns of the freestanding walled bungalows housing British officers, and later the Indian upper and middle classes, and the large gardens of government institutions or recreational parks, mainly for the colonial elite, and the meticulously maintained landscaping along the broad tree-lined avenues of the civil station and cantonment. So the map sort of shows that growing city. This map is from 1867. And you see, crucially, the old city, the river, the growing civil station. Beyond it, marking the sort of path right around the middle is the canal. And then the cantonment, which is built 5 miles southeast of the city during this time. So it's really a moment in time where things are in flux. But what I want to underscore is that this emergent landscape is irrigated by water from the Bari Doab Canal, extending through watercourses to irrigate government facilities, parks, new residential areas, the garden I've been talking about, indicating a very tangible, very functional relationship between regional and urban development, between country and city. It is also during this time, 2 years after the conquest of Punjab, that members of Lahore's European community formed the Punjab Agri-Horticulture Society. Modeled on similar societies across India, notably the Agri-Horticulture Society of India, formed in Calcutta in 1820, the Punjab Society aimed to introduce and develop agriculture, arboriculture, and horticulture at, quote, this extremity of the empire. To do this, the society would form nurseries and gardens across the province, distribute seeds and plants to cultivators, conduct experiments on imported species, test for soil and climate suitability, and correspond regularly with farmers and cultivators across the province. Notably, it was important, one thing that kind of keeps coming up in their literature is the idea of persuading Indian cultivators and farmers to change their existing practices along more scientific lines. And Lahore and its soils and its ground plays an interesting role in all of this. When the society was founded, Henry Cope, its founding secretary, wrote to the Governor General to petition for financial support and specifically for the use of 3 different gardens in Lahore to conduct experiments and acclimatize new species and establish a nursery and hold garden shows. So the 3 gardens that they asked for were the Badami Bagh, which is north of the walled city, closer to the river, a soldier's garden in the old neighborhood of Anarkali, and then one in Mia Mir in that cantonment that was just, really under construction, not even. At that time, I think just the site had been chosen. So Cope noted that these 3 sites would enable the society to, quote, secure a variety of soil, and thus to represent the key environmental conditions of Punjab, notably the fertile alluvial tracts as well as the semi-arid doabs, where agricultural production, and we know that already that doabs were where the agricultural production through irrigation was most urgently sought at the time. So in this way, the city can be seen almost as a model for the region. Eventually, though, the society was compelled to consider a different location when these sites didn't work out for different reasons. The new site was acquired on a, quote, suitable piece of ground in the vicinity of the Lieutenant Governor's residence. It was centrally located in the civil station of colonial Lahore, but it was much more than an urban amenity. Here, the creation of a municipal park and then with it, the unfolding development of a new landscape aesthetic in the city emerged from and intertwined with this broader economic and social agenda for remaking Punjab's agrarian spaces. Rather than being conceived, and William Glover has written about this particular garden being conceived as a major ornament for the city, for the capital city of Punjab. But I tend to disagree with that. The main function here was experimental cultivation, plant and seed distribution, the training of gardeners, malis, and the dissemination of plant knowledge. All of this together then helps to usher a sort of enduring horticultural aesthetic, a sort of a modern landscape aesthetic and design in the city. The engineering of newly colonized Punjab's semi-arid interfluvial areas into ostensibly productive landscapes through canal building, agrarian reorganization, horticultural research were not just a backdrop then, but a key driver of urban development. The city became, and I've looked at this in other parts of my work, different ways: a testing ground, a model, a palette, a dissemination hub, a site for improvement. And where the ideologies and infrastructures of improvement fused with and reshaped the meanings and cultures of urban nature. In 1860, when the society first purchased this property in the fast expanding civil station, it reported that, quote, a great part of the site was at the time waste, but that it contained some plots of good soil. So this is resonant with other descriptions of this broader area at the time, such as we see one of those examples in John Lockwood Kipling and Thomas Henry Thornton's 1960 travelogue, which describes this area as, quote, utter waste and desolate, an artificial desert, ruined waste. And we see this again in this 1837 map, which precedes that moment of the colonial, the civil station's development, where that area is, I don't know if it's super visible, but the word ruins is inscribed right below in that area that is sort of just about to be transformed. The evocation of waste in the garden, in the city, replays the moral and aesthetic tropes of improvement writ large. Now, for many of you, this is probably quite well-trod territory, but waste is an important discursive instrument within the paradigm of improvement. As geographers Vinay Gidwani and Raj Reddy write, it is the political other of capitalist value. So waste and value are kind of two sides of the same coin. For Gidwani and Reddy, who trace the concept to John Locke's theory of value, which postulates that to improve nature through labor, that is the sort of fundamental requirement for entry into civil society. Here, waste is always the other face of value. It is an endemic presence in the colonial archive, in the archive of irrigation, agriculture, engineering, and urban policy. It shows up variously as uncultivated land, commonly held land, lack of cultivation, unproductive uses, land lying fallow, underutilized water, the waste of water, and so on. Waste links deficiency with material excess, meaning what can then be done with it, and unrealized potential. In doing so, it reinforces also, and many people have studied this, the racialized narratives of laziness and savagery to sanction enclosure and dispossession, and then the enforcement of individual property rights over common uses. In the garden itself, I'm interested in how waste takes on a distinctly material urgency. Soil conditions were a persistent challenge. For example, in 1862, Dr. Burton Brown, who was the professor of botany and chemistry at the Lahore Medical School and responsible for overseeing the development of the new garden, wrote about the ill effects of efflorescence in the Punjab soil. We see this also in efforts, for example, to import and plant eucalyptus trees, such as the one seen here, an experiment which species was the best at holding, at sort of withstanding soil salinity. And if anyone here obviously has worked with the ground in Lahore, salinity continues to be a sort of a perennial challenge, a developmentalist challenge for those of us who studied geography in high school as well. In his accounts in the annual reports, Spooner again similarly talks about these material deficiencies, about the dismal state of the soil, about salinity, about uneven terrain, about the substratum of calcareous kunker, and the astounding pace of weed growth and decaying plants. So efforts to clear the land, to drain it, are ongoing in these early decades of the garden's existence and elsewhere in Lahore. Tracing such accounts of practice reveals how the material guises of waste, soil salinity, uneven ground, poor drainage, and so on, come to condition and unsettle experiences, as well as the scope and expectations for improvement. Yet, it is not insignificant that colonial discourse often attributed the perceived biophysical deficiencies not to the unfitness of the soil, but to the presumed lack of customary knowledge or improper methods for cultivation. So coming back to Dalhousie's claim that the soil was grateful, only it just needed to be improved. This kind of discourse validated and sped up, of course, claims for social-spatial interventions. So in this sense, I'm leaving this slide blank because we don't have documentation of dhobis, of course. So in this sense, the ostensible spoliation of the ground in relation to the practice of washing clothes is telling. Briefly, I'll return to Chattopadhyay's work. In a recent discussion, she cited the example of political graffiti in India as an example of something that needs to be read differently. And what does she mean by that? So wall writing or graffiti is banned by the state, and it is thus subject to effacement through whitewashing on the pretext of keeping cities clean and sanitized and for protecting property. She then argues for a new practice of reading these types of erasures, which doesn't take at face value the idea for cleanliness or the aim, the ambition of cleanliness. Instead, it recognizes that the political potential of wall writing, the thing that the state really wants to erase, are the visions, quote, the visions of the body politic that are not sanctioned by the state. As she cautions, the banning of wall writing to achieve a desired cleanliness in the city and to protect property is bound up in the excision of particular voices and relations to create a hygienic public sphere. So hygienic read more than just about cleanliness. Now I recognize and acknowledge that washing clothes is not wall writing, it's not graffiti. It doesn't have that same, let's say, political potency. But the attempted sanitization of the garden's grounds to get rid of bad smells and standing water and rank vegetation, particularly so because they're associated with marginalized practices, speaks similarly to the segregative and exclusionary logics of colonial improvement. It's my one Dhobi slide. As one of the lowest service castes of South Asia, Dhobis' lives and labor have been equally circumscribed by their essential role in the maintenance of upper caste lives and their status as untouchable. So the cleansing of bodily and environmental impurities from clothes and linens is then associated with the absorption of those impurities by Dhobis' own bodies. Anthropologist S.M. Channa, in her ethnographic study of Dhobi communities in Delhi, writes that while Dhobis form a, quote, essential part of the city's geography and architecture and social and economic life, their presence, including in modern planning, is defined by attempts at segregation and marginalization. Dhobi Ghats were often located both in old quarters of South Asian cities as well as along rivers, such as the Yamuna in Delhi and the Ravi in Lahore. But as watercourses from the recently completed Lahore branch of the Bari Doab Canal, which I talked about earlier, were extended into the city and into the new cantonment, they also provided a source for clothes washing for local communities. In this context, now we also have the spread of malaria and cholera, and especially the colonial anxiety around it being heightened around native practices. So while colonial infrastructures like canals and railways had already by this point been recognized as a key source in the rise of malarial epidemics in the region, we still have a sort of a, let's say, culpability being issued towards or culpability being associated with native bodies and practices. And they're more widely attributed as sources of contagion and contamination, as vectors for disease. As one colonial observer administrator wrote in 1877, for example, there was a need to station police sentries by watercourses in Miami to prevent so-called native pollution, night bathing, or clothes washing. Sanitary discourse in this sense, colonial sanitary discourse, absorbs and amplifies casteist frameworks of untouchability and pollution. These are replayed in the garden as Dhobis and their work site is erased from a space that was, of course, intended not just to cultivate vegetables and plants, but to practically, quote, demonstrate enlightened rule of European colonial powers over nature, end quote. And it was supposed to demonstrate the desired effects of improvement through these didactic and elite spectacles of plant displays, shows, and exhibitions. So in that context, it is important to ask, as Mubashir Rizvi does, and I'm quoting him, what other histories are lying scattered and gathered in mounds, which are then made subject to leveling and clearing? So beyond sanitary logics, I'm interested in this historical fragment because it speaks to the ways in which improvement renders invisible other logics of inhabitation, other logics of engagement. In this case, a place where people's ties to land are embedded in collective practices and non-propertied relations with urban nature, rather than claims of ownership or visions of improvement. In a site whose pre-colonial state was almost always defined as no more than waste or a wasteland, which needed to then be disciplined into productivity and landscape beauty, here we see a rare, if fleeting glimpse into quite different social relations with land, of waste as commons, an alternate communal use, associated with the traditionally marginalized lower caste labor of washing clothes. Rather than overlooking this fragment, this archival fragment, I suggest that thinking of this group of dhobis as agents, as a public engaged in the making of a spatial commons, offers a different vantage point, a different perspective towards places and communities who are under new rounds of erasure today. To just briefly elaborate on this as I wrap up, I'll shift not in scale this time, but in time, to think about how the ground as waste continues to be the terrain for improvement in its colonial returns under contemporary urbanization. As the economist Atif Mia wrote recently, land in Pakistani cities is the favored vehicle, quote, through which the powerful extract rents from the economy. Yet doing so necessitates the kind of discursive and technological and, most importantly, material assemblage, the sort of coming together of these different things to render and stabilize land as resource. This is, I'm drawing here from the work of geographer Tanya Murray Lee, who writes about the different meanings and assemblages, she uses the word assemblage, of land in the making of land as territory, in the making of land as something that is then valued. In other words, processes of land acquisition and new rounds of enclosure and development all require the ground to be dug up, to be broken, to be compacted, filled, moved, planted, and more. This material conversion of land in the urban process is then grafted onto older histories of the ground's transformations. For example, in Lahore's southern and northern peripheries. In May this year, I watched as dozens of excavators, compactors, tractors, and graders, and other heavy earth-moving machinery regraded land along the river's northern bed in the Sheikhupura district. This area falls in the first phase of the Ravi development, a 40-acre master plan to create an entirely new city on both sides of the river along the northern and western periphery of Lahore's metropolitan area. Nearby, an oddly designed monument with glass pillars of varying heights unceremoniously commemorated the project's 2020 groundbreaking by the former Prime Minister Imran Khan. In a public announcement in 2022, Khan, who was seen, and I don't picture that here, but he was seen standing in front of the river promoting the development as a necessary corrective to Lahore's unplanned development, to water scarcity, housing shortages, flooding, food insecurity, river pollution, you have it. It will fix everything. It would not only be a modern city with high-rise mixed-use buildings, but he also stressed, gesturing in both directions, with both hands, sorry, I can't do that, that it would be one with jungles to clean the atmosphere and barrages to save the Ravi and raise the water level. He underscored that in addition to environmental benefits, the development would provide a much-needed boost for Pakistan's debt-strapped economy, attracting investment, providing jobs, and creating wealth. Echoing the age-old mantra of waste, it is telling that the Ravi's very real pollution is then mobilized in this new developmentalist vision for its revival. Yet the future that the development's boosters promise, and which Khan sketches, much like Henry Baton Powell all those years ago, is not inevitable, neither is it unquestioned. While its sustainability agenda rehashes the aesthetics and nomenclatures of Islamic gardens as well as tropical paradises and what have you, its reenactment of colonial processes of enclosure and eviction and its greenwashing tactics, of course, are not unchallenged. As many of you know, a growing movement of local residents, landowners, farmers, artists, together with environmental and peasant rights groups, have specifically called out the project as a land grab by developers, abetted by the state's use of the Colonial Era Land Acquisition Act of 1894. Back in May, a local farmer, one of the few who had held out against the state's efforts at land acquisition, lamented that what was Haryali, what was green and verdant, was now becoming Veran, was being laid waste, becoming wilderness, only then to be handed over to developers. Midday temperatures that day soared above 48 degrees amidst a second deadly heat wave in the country. and his wife worried aloud about the prospects for further glacier melt and further flooding. In this context, channelizing the river and blocking its flow, they both agreed, would be untenable and disastrous. While recent scholarly and policy research has looked closely at the legal, economic, and social dimensions of land acquisition and dispossession in relation to contemporary urban development across South Asia, there is less attention to the material logics to the logics of materiality and to their attendant aesthetics. How are the materialities of land, mobilized as waste, continue to abet its capture? How, behind the renewed visions for productivity and ecology and sustainability, are the fundamentally climate-changing logics of colonial improvement? And at the same time, as the afterlives of improvement, like the tractors along the Ravi, continue to flatten and pave over land and landscapes, they make it easier to miss other, more diverse, more unexpected forms, materialities, practices, relations, and aesthetics of urban nature. Environmental knowledge is often seen as the purview of credentialed experts, those of us sitting in this room. But attention to local ecological knowledge, material practices, and to different relations with the ground, which are outside the rubrics of waste and value, can bring a different and more important vantage point to push back against the uneven formations of improvement towards what else was there and what else may yet be in its place. Thank you.